Good evening, everyone. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge um, the First Nation people of the land where I am online. I pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and traditional owners and custodians of the land. Today, I'm speaking to you all from the Kulin Nation, where many of us on the panel and in the audience are coming together from the confines of our home, from the many nations of Australia as well as overseas. I also pay my respect to the First Nation people of those nations. I extend that to any Aboriginal who is joining us to this meeting today. This is an important time for instructional work to promote and advance social justice for us all. In our session today, though we are going to talk about the single issue that we have managed to unite hundreds of thousands on our collective campaign work over the years. I'm sure as many of you know about the End Child Detention Coalition, but for those of you who don't know, so ECD, End Child Detention Coalition, or ECDC, is a 26-member organization from across Australia, among which there is a total of 150 staff and around 1,200 volunteers and approximately 220,000 supporters across all the states and territories. Collectively, these organization possess a wealth experience in policy and advocacy, advocating together for the release of children from immigration detention. It's not a place for a child. My name is Hayat Akbari. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I was resettled to Australia a few years ago. I have been involved with the ECDC campaign for the past 4 years. I've been advocating for the rights of children, those who are detained in Australia. As someone who was victim of the detention, I want to advocate and be voice of those for those voiceless people. We have two great panelists today here, and I want to introduce them to you all. First of all, Professor David Isaacs, who is a paediatrician at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, Sydney, and clinical professor in Paediatric Infectious Diseases at the University of Sydney. He is one of the several doctors who have worked extensively on Nauru and has first-hand knowledge of the impact of immigration detention on child health and development. Second, Alice Battison. Alice is a lawyer and a principal of Human Rights for All. Alice has represented some of the most notable immigration detention cases held recently in Australian High Court. She has been a considerable part of ensuring that children should not be in detention. And in this session, she analyzes why now is the key time. So just as a matter of housekeeping, first we're going to give time to the two panelists, and after that, I'm sure most of you have some burning questions that you want to ask. We have 15 minutes towards the end of the session where you can put your question in the chat, and we'll make sure to ask those questions. But we can't ensure that we will ask all those questions. We will do our best. First of all, I will put the question to Alice. Alice, I want to ask you, are children still detained in Australia? And if so, can you tell us the number of children who are currently in detention in Australia? Alice, please.
Thanks, Hayat. Thanks everyone for being interested and having me here. Look, there are obviously still children in immigration detention centres in Australia. And the disturbing thing is that we think there are 3, but we don't actually know the numbers. And the reason we don't know the numbers is, for example, my client Isabella, who's a bit over 2 years old and was born in detention, she's classified as a guest in immigration detention. So she doesn't show up on the official statistics that the department publishes each month. So, you know, it's possible there's more. I don't think there are at the moment, but the statistics are massaged in that sense. Now, claiming that a child is a guest and can effectively leave detention at any time is an absolute fallacy, and is a very underhanded way of still detaining children, but without any of the ease of oversight of regulatory bodies, the law and the public, because it's so difficult to find out about Isabella. And of course, Isabella was the little playmate of the Biloela children, who were then transferred to Christmas Island. You know, and very upsetting for her to be separated. So it's not even like all the kids are together in the one place either.
Thanks, Alice. I will also put a question on, can you go into some details of why some children are still detained in Australia? And also, what challenges do you face working in this area of detention?
So the challenges for child detention in Australia are enormous. There is no legislation in place that prevents child detention. There's no legislation in place that, or case law that prevents the detention of entire families. So it's in Australia, there's no right to liberty. We don't have a Bill of Human Rights. So liberty is something that we all think is out there and is guaranteed. It's not. And it's very easy to legislate to take that away. I think we're in a particularly difficult period at the moment. And without naming names, I have to say Minister Dutton rules home affairs with an iron fist. And it's because of him that there has been such a hard line that is taken. We have taken, for example, Isabella's case to the United Nations, and they have been very clear to rule that it's detention in a very coercive situation. So where the mother was in the hospital about to give birth and a border force official turned up with a piece of paper saying, if you want your baby to stay with you when she's born, sign this and get rid of all liability for the department. You know, what mother is not going to sign that if you plan on breastfeeding or, you know, having any connection with your child? The worrying thing is that despite many calls for Isabella to be released and her mother, who has no criminal record, the government has ignored that. And as a sort of a topical update, the case yesterday that called, where Justice Flick called for Dutton, if he doesn't make a decision in a particular case, to be held in contempt of court by the end of next week, that was one of our cases, and the court had really gone above and beyond to give Dutton the chance to comply with the law. And we are in the incredibly worrying position where we have a separation of powers in Australia, and if one limb of that refuses to act within their role and not outside of it, it brings everything into disrepute.
Thanks, Alice. Now, I would like to ask a question from Professor Isaac. Professor Isaac, we know that you worked in Nauru as a paediatrician when children were detained there. What's your professional opinion of the impact of detention on the children who were detained in Nauru?
Yeah, look, thanks, Hayat, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. And I'd also like to recognise that I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and we stole it from the Aboriginal people, and I recognise their elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here. And your people as well, the Hazara people, Hayat, I recognise them as great friends these days now. So look, I'm a paediatrician, as you know, and I didn't work on Nauru for long. I ran a refugee clinic, and I have done for 15 years now, and in Sydney, and got interested in the health of welfare of children coming as refugees to Australia, and more recently as people coming as asylum seekers, so seeking asylum but not already accepted, as not having visas when they left their home country, which is a very different group of people because they're not treated as citizens in the way that other refugees are. And as part of that, I was asked by International Health and Medical Services if I would go to Nauru to consult on children there, just to help out, to see, just for a few days, for the children that they had problems and that they wanted a paediatrician to consult, because there are no paediatricians on Nauru. So Nauru is a tiny island, as you know, of 10,000 population only, and very substandard medical services there. Whatever Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison say, it is nothing like Australia, the medical services there. And so I went out there for 5 days, and I agonized about whether I should go. Was that in some way colluding with the government? So International Health and Medical Services, IHMS, is a non-government, a private health organization, but they are funded by the Australian government to provide health care, both onshore in Australia to people seeking asylum and refugees, and offshore. And I insisted on going with a nurse, Alana Maycock, who's an amazing character, who was, and then she and I went, and we went there for 5 days only. In that time, I saw 30 children in consultation out of the 200 or so that were on the island. They're the most traumatized parents and children I've ever seen. I was shattered by it. And I mean, to say what I felt is just to say how horrified I was by what it had done to these families. So there was a sort of personal thing which still hurts as I tell you about it. And this was December 2014, so it was over 5 years ago. And those families, they didn't know what was going to happen to them. They had no control over their destiny. That was the horrible thing for them. They could protest as much as, you know, it's what Ali was just saying in a way. You protest as much as you like and nobody will listen. There's nobody to talk to. And I would go there and talk to them through interpreters, and people would say to me, you're the first person that's ever talked nicely to these families, that said not everyone hates you, that said that we're going to try and do our best for you. And I had actually signed a contract that said I wouldn't publicize it when I got back to Australia. And when I got back, I agonized over it. Ali knows my son had been working on Nauru as a carer for young men there some couple of years before that. And Ali knows him personally, my son Mark, and I talked to him. Mark had worked with Julian Burnside, the human rights lawyer, who was trying to get people off Nauru. And so Julian Burnside said, you are allowed, you're not breaking your contract if you expose iniquity. And what you've described to me, and I'd written about it, was iniquitous. You know, out of all conscience that we would be doing that to people. And so I was able to write it. IHMS were furious with me, and of course I'll never be invited back. And so since then, we've been doing our very best to get the children off Nauru. I know that Scott Morrison thinks he's got some credit for that, but it took many years to get people really to listen at how awful the things were happening to children on Nauru. So over that time, by February 2018, there were still 158 children on Nauru. And everybody started working together. There was a huge Kids Off Nauru campaign that got a whole lot of people working for it. World Vision kicked it off, if you like, but lots of other, Amnesty were involved. The lawyers were very, very vocal and very much involved. And the doctors worked with the lawyers, which was one of the most fascinating things in my career. You know, I'm at the end of my career now, but I've never had to work so closely with lawyers and as colleagues and friends. And, you know, doctors always make bad jokes about lawyers and lawyers make bad jokes about doctors. But the amount of respect we got from each other for this is phenomenal, I have to say. And one of the positives for me was meeting people like Ali, like Julian Burnside, like the top lawyers, they're fantastic people, Gillian Triggs, and together getting the children off Nauru. But I will say one other thing was that when we were trying to get off the children off Nauru, quite a lot of them started presenting with something called pervasive refusal syndrome, or they just wouldn't eat and they would turn their faces to the wall. These are kids of about 10 years of age, mostly, although some were very young, from 4 or 5 were the youngest. And these children just stopped eating. They stayed in bed, they wouldn't go to school. These were children who a few months earlier had been going to school happily, and they seemed to have lost the will to live almost. They were losing weight, they were in real danger of dying. And the lawyers started getting onto these children and saying they've got to come to Australia for treatment. And the government said no. And we're not going to let them come. And so the lawyers would say, we've got to go to the courts. And so we, Alana Maycock, started organizing doctors to Skype these children and their families in Nauru. So we would be in Australia, they'd be in Nauru, and we'd do a consultation over the phone with video link. And then we would write a report, send it to the lawyers would go to the courts, and just before they were going to go to the court, the government would give in and let the children come. So we got lots of children across that way. Maybe 35 or so children came that way through doctors and lawyers working together. And then there was the big rush at the end of that. And by the end of the year, all the children were off Nauru. But that was because public sentiment switched. And everyone suddenly said, this is not okay to have children in detention on Nauru. So we managed finally to persuade the Australian people to hear what was going on Nauru, but it took us 5 years. And the children we were getting off Nauru in 2018 had been on the island for 5 years in detention. That's a longer jail sentence than you get. Oh, that's longer than Cardinal Pell got, wasn't it? So, you know, it's really quite a, what has been done to these families is unconscionable.
Thanks, Professor David. And I also should say the things that you said and the experience that you had from Nauru, I personally, who has the experience of detention, I can tell you that putting children in detention is absolutely unacceptable, and also it can have a long impact on them. As a personal experience, when I was also put in detention, I can tell you that I had to go through the psychology for 1 year.
Yeah.
The reason behind being is because I was put in this one room for one year. Although I should clarify that it wasn't Australia, it was overseas. But as a matter of just talking about the impact of detention, when I came to Australia, I had to go to a psychologist for 1 year, and it was only because those 1 year had impacted me psychologically, and also emotionally. And
so
also, I'm sure. Yep.
Sorry, Hayat. I was just going to say there are studies to show that prolonged immigration detention has a very profound effect on people's mental health. And the government tries to say, oh, it's just because of what they experience as refugees and the trauma. But there's added trauma from prolonged immigration detention. And I'll tell you something, that one time I went I was listening to a talk by Julian Burnside, actually, that he was giving with Rod Bauer in Gosford. And I said something about what was going on and that it was like Guantanamo. And he said, oh, it's not as bad as that. And it made me think about that. And then I thought, actually, Guantanamo wasn't children. It was adults. And maybe it was as bad as Guantanamo. And that made me think, what does this constitute? And in fact, I've written a paper saying this is torture. I know the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said it was torture, but he didn't say why it was torture. So I published in the Journal of Medical Ethics a paper in which was told I had to work out exactly why what we're doing constitutes torture. And it's because it's deliberate, because the people it's being done to have not done anything to justify them being in prison. If they were criminals, that might justify them being in prison, but they've done nothing to do that. And it's deliberately trying to damage their mental health to deter other people from seeking asylum. So that constitutes torture. And I think that's worth saying again and again.
And I think we see with some of our clients, the more years that I've been involved in this work, a revolving door of heavily damaged individuals from experiences of detention in Australia and overseas, but in Australia as children, and then presenting with criminality when they're over 18, have their visa cancelled and they're back in immigration detention again, which, doesn't solve any of the medical problems or mental health problems of such refugees. And it's what we've done.
Yeah. Look, I agree with that. I mean, I think Hayat's a wonderful example of someone who did have problems from it, and none of us knows how long, what would have happened if he hadn't been detained. Would he have been in a much better place? Presumably, yes. But who's also shown incredible resilience and is now doing a law degree and so on. And a number of my patients, my child patients, are doing well. And when we try and work out what helps them do well, what makes them resilient, it's often how their parents are coping. So for the younger children, at least, if their parents are coping okay, the children are coping quite well. Going through the schooling system in Australia is that helps them a lot as well. But none of us really knows how long and how profoundly the psychological effects of prolonged immigration detention will last.
Thanks. Before I proceed to the next question, I will I'll ask people, if you have any question, please use the section where it says Q&A and put your question. We'll ask your question towards the end of the session. So the next question I'll ask Alice, please, if you can give us a sense of the international laws and as they are related to child detention, and what about the national laws in Australia, if there is one?
So international law, basically all of them. It's a very, you don't need to be a lawyer or an international lawyer to figure out that detaining children is wrong and against law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I always get this name wrong, so I'm going to read it. The Committee on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. It's the prohibition on detaining children in immigration detention, or in fact, outside the criminal justice system, is pervasive through all international law. Now, the worrying thing about that is that has not flowed through in any way, shape or form into Australian domestic legislation. There was a famous case, it's called Teo, which I'm sure Hayat has studied about, where there is a lacuna, a gap in national law, and there's an international covenant on or treaty on that particular area of law, then there's a legitimate expectation that the law in Australia is applied as per the international law. Now, that case, although it was fantastic, it's very difficult to apply now because there are no gaps. And it's very clear that the government means to detain children. It's also very clear that this is an interesting point, but it's in the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention opinion on Isabella and her mum Gwen, where it talks about not only can't you detain the child, but you must keep the family unit together. So you also cannot detain older siblings or the parents. They have to be released as a unit. So you can't separate the children. And I have a very unfortunate situation the situation's over now, but only just, where a single man and his two very young, under the age of 10 children came to Australia, and trigger warning in terms of abuse, but the two boys were raped in immigration detention in Australia. And the response was to remove the boys from detention, but keep the dad in detention, and he wasn't the perpetrator. Now, that is absolutely contrary to international law. And the boys were placed in a sort of a group hostel situation for over 4 years until we could also get the father out. Now, that is entirely unacceptable. The whole family unit has to go as one.
Thanks, Alice. Professor Isaac, in my opinion, the doctors, and what also you have explained before, the doctors played a key role in convincing our leaders that children should not be detained, which to date has been largely successful, although it's obviously not in our national law. Yet, as Alison highlighted, what are your reflections on this work?
I think the doctors and the lawyers persuaded the public. I don't think we ever persuaded the government. And you say persuaded our leaders. One of my great disappointments is that there's been no real opposition to immigration detention. It was introduced by the Labour government 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago now, and has been perpetrated by progressive governments. And there is no good opposition. Gillian Triggs, as you know, targeted children in immigration detention because they're so clearly, it's terrible to say innocent, as if their parents are guilty for seeking asylum, which is within international law, as you know. But their parents weren't guilty, but the children had no say in it. And so Gillian Triggs deliberately said, look at what's happening to children. Surely everyone can feel that that's wrong. And true enough, you know, for a long time, the Australian public has not been opposed to immigration detention. In fact, 60% of the public said that Australia's policy was okay or not severe enough. But 80% of people said it wasn't okay to have children on Nauru and in detention. And that's when everybody was convinced, finally. But we need to fight that battle some more. And we still need not to forget the people on Manus. We need not to forget the people in the immigration centres that are around, as you know, 400 and more of them. Well, 1,400, I think it is, isn't it? Ali, you can tell me, that are still in immigration detention, having been transferred from Manus, but not allowed out of the so-called APODs, the alternative places of detention.
And if so, I could add to that, one of the reasons that we need to keep fighting this battle is to avoid backsliding, but also the nature of detention centres from the 2000s to 2010 to 2015, but 2015 onwards has dramatically changed, the makeup of the people in those detention centres. And because there is now a much larger proportion of non-refugees who are in the detention centres, and people who've come from prison and are going to be deported back to places where they won't face harm, they're incredibly violent places. So we've done a recent Freedom of Information request that shows that in the 5 years from 2015 onwards, there were over 4,200 assaults in Australia's onshore centres. Now, that is the environment that the Biloela family and Isabella are kept in. Incredibly violent and stress-inducing, you know, the mental health of the parents of trying to protect children from that sort of anger and violence is very detrimental.
Thanks. Professor Isaac, another question regarding to the current strange time that we're living in, the COVID-19 situation. So a guard at the detention center in Brisbane who tested positive for the COVID-19 really highlighted the risk of contagion in the small space. Do you see this as a powerful reminder of why children shouldn't be in detention?
Well, I think that's a separate issue in a way, because children aren't at particular harm from COVID-19. Surprisingly, they get it less severely and they're less likely to get it. But in terms of what it says about immigration detention generally, there's a huge disconnect between the government saying that everyone should physically distance and then putting men on top of each other in immigration detention. And I and others, I got together over 1,000 signatures, mainly through my daughter, who is in medical mums, and got all the medical mothers together signing this petition to the government. And many others have been saying this is not okay. We've got the whole of the infectious disease community of Australia saying that's not all right to have these men in detention when they're meant to be physically distancing, and they can't. But the government is treating them as if they were prisoners. They haven't released all the prisoners, which has been looked at in some other countries. And so they're not going to release these men from detention. And it's got some airing in the press. The SBS tried very hard to make this, Craig Foster, the soccer player, has been making a huge thing about MITRE in Melbourne there. But so far we've had no luck getting those men out and getting the government to acknowledge their problem.
Thanks. Before we move to the question put by the audience, I'll ask the last question from Alice. What alternatives to immigration detention exist? Are any of these appropriate for children?
Many, so many. I mean, we are the only country that does this. And does it for open-ended, extended periods of time. And there's already provision in the Australian legislation to do that. So, you can have conditional visas, you can have community detention where you just have to sleep at a specific residence, but otherwise you're, free to come and go. But, if immigration needs to find you, they can go to that residence. There's been nothing in Australia to trial things like, oh, okay, we're worried about criminality, use a tracking mechanism or something else. So it's for Australia, as it keeps telling the UN in response to our submissions, that detention is a measure of last resort. Well, in fact, it's a measure of first resort, because under the law, if you are an unlawful non-citizen, you must be detained. An officer must detain you. So, alternatives just have not been examined in any detail. And the power for residence determination is a personal, non-reviewable, non-compellable power by the Minister of Home Affairs or the Minister of Immigration. So that's not really a mechanism that anyone can use in any meaningful manner.
Yep. Thanks to both of you for sharing your thoughts and comments. So now we will go to the question put by the audience. So the first question is to Alice. Given that Australia does not have a Bill of Rights, what legislation is needed to prevent child detention in Australia? Or should we put our energy into advocating for a Bill of Rights?
So this is a complex question in many ways, and I'm glad that it was asked. My view on it is to put energy into advocating for a Bill of Rights, because unfortunately, public sentiment is such that as soon as people get a whiff of immigrants potentially being released from detention, refugees, it lowers the support for whatever you're trying to do. I do quite a bit of public speaking, and everyone, the majority of groups, are incredibly surprised that there's no right to liberty in Australia. Now, that's something that's threatening for all of us. So I think if you can repackage the message, it would be much more effective. I know the End Child Detention Coalition is looking at legislation. It wouldn't be that difficult to legislate. The difficulty is legislating so the parents are also released. And that is something that would face massive pushback from the Liberal Party.
Thanks. I think this question, either of you can answer this question. So it says, what can be done to release the children who are currently in detention? There are many questions in this, but I would love to hear from you guys, either of you, so Alice or David.
I think you, Ali.
Look, we are on a marathon, not a sprint. So with Isabella, we have been to the UN several times due to attempted deportations, including attempting to deport Isabella's mum Gwen without Isabella, which, you know, it would be incredibly distressing for the entire family. Isabella's mum never actually went through a statutory process to determine whether she's a refugee or not. So the department has determined in their own wisdom that she's not, but she hasn't been through a proper independent review. Now, that in itself is incredibly concerning. The way I'm viewing it at the moment to put pressure on to get people out of detention and children out of detention is public opinion. It has to change. You have to keep pushing it. And unfortunately, you know, you get people, you know, our politicians going on, you know, media saying there's no children in detention. I'm pretty sure I act for one. I don't, you know, openly lying and the Labor Party not calling them out for it. You know, it is a political solution and a public pressure solution at this point.
Yeah, and I would say, Ali, thanks, that I mean, the one message that I did think, positive message we had, was that public opinion about the children on Nauru did change.
Yep.
And so, you know, from 2014 until 2018, nobody wanted to know about the kids on Nauru. And suddenly everyone started to hear about these children in terrible trouble. I mean, pervasive refusal syndrome, I don't know how a child didn't die. Once or twice we Skyped children and I thought they were dead. They were not moving, they were white as a sheet, and we were petrified that a child was going to die. You know, one of them ended up in intensive care, and luckily for the government, luckily for the families, nobody died, but it was only by the grace of whatever. And but public opinion changed. And so there is hope that we can persuade people. You know, the plight of the Sri Lankan family, whose name you know off the top of your head and I don't, on Christmas Island is a terrible one. And we need everyone to suddenly say, this is not okay. This is not the way we should be treating people. And we've done that for children, and we need to do it for adults as well. I was actually at a meeting where Beirut Buchani, just after we'd got all the kids off Nauru and we were all feeling rather pleased with ourselves, and I was at an amnesty meeting and Karen Phelps was talking there. It was in the Sydney Town Hall, and Beirut Buchani came on by video link and said, please don't forget the adults. And we mustn't. We must not forget the adults as well. So much as I applaud everything you're doing for children, please get the adults off as well and out of detention.
Well, and the point there is that the adults have children.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big flow-on effects we see in onshore detention, is that it's normally the father who remains in detention or is re-detained, and the impacts on the families here are, or overseas where they can't work to send money back to Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq, are enormous. So you have female-headed households in those countries that are very vulnerable.
Yeah. Interestingly, Ali, as we were getting the kids off Nauru, some of the early ones, they separated families.
Yeah.
And they'd bring the sick child and one parent and leave the others on Nauru virtually as hostage, really.
Yeah.
And the lawyers realized that, and we did as well. And together we said, let's not do this anymore. When we say the child's got to come off, it's got to be the whole family.
Yeah.
And eventually the families all did come.
Yeah.
And after a certain point, it was the whole family that came at once, mum, dad, and any siblings all at once. Yeah.
Just on that note of changing people's opinion,
Yeah.
what can we as a people actually do to change people's sentiment?
Educate yourself and have proper informed discussion. So Dutton came out at one point this year and was talking about anchor babies. We don't have anchor babies in Australia. There's no legislation. In fact, we specifically legislated so there are no anchor babies where you come to Australia, have a baby, and then they're a citizen so you can stay. In fact, that's the Biloela family. They are unlawful non-citizens because even though they were born here. So educate yourself and pick your audience. It's talk about that no one has the right to liberty, therefore no one is safe.
And I also say, when I'm talking publicly, I say, well, how many of you actually know any refugees? And most of the audience is white and they don't know any refugees and they've never met someone. And I say, go and meet someone like Hayat, volunteer. You'll find they're people just like us, good, bad, all of us, and the more that you meet and talk to people from an overseas background, the broader you get a view of what people are like generally, I think. So people are scared of people, scared of the other, scared of difference. And so one of the ways just to say, go out there, work with people. And Heather Kirkpatrick's wonderful documentary, Mary Meets Mohammed, that film, where Mary's in Tasmania somewhere and she starts looking after Mohammed, who's a refugee who was in prison there, or was in immigration detention there. And her friends sort of start joining in as well. And oh, he's actually quite a nice young man, It's sort of ridiculous. But that's the way. Otherwise, people just can distance themselves and pretend that it's other people and it doesn't they don't have to care about them.
I think that the point on educating yourself is one of the important solution. I'm saying this because I remember last year there was a video made by some young, amazing young people from Adelaide, where they went to different parts of the regional areas in Australia and asked them that why refugees come to Australia. And what there was one point which shocked me was that there's these 10 to 12 years school students saying that they're coming here because of the economy, because they're poor and because they don't have money. That's why they're coming here. And I absolutely understand why they're saying that, and also because of lack of education, lack of knowledge about who they are, why they're coming here. So I think that's the solution on educating yourself is important. So the next question is put on me, which is saying that we know you're an important young leader and a role model for many young people, thank you, from refugee and asylum seeker background. What has helped you in building your life in Australia since coming years ago and experiencing mandatory detention as a child and young person? I think personally for me, what has been the motive or what has been motivating personally is that going to university and being first person in your family to graduate from university was a dream for my family, and I am the first family in my whole family to graduate from university. So appreciation from my family and support from family, and also having good friends and being surrounded with good people like such as the questionnaire is the people that motivated me and people that helped me throughout my journey. And I'm glad to say that I graduated and finished my degree recently. So I've graduated from my degree and I look forward what's next. So
hey,
thanks.
Congratulations.
Thanks. So the next question is, I should say that this will be the last question before we wrap up. Do we know whether there's any way to get the Labour Party to work with the crossbench and get refugees out of detention, especially those who have children, also reunite refugee families?
Look, very difficult, because as David said, Labor started offshore detention, and both political parties have been responsible for mandatory detention. That being said, I think for some reason at the state level, there appears to be more support for Labor to end detention. It's still difficult at the federal level. But I think if there's enough swing of public opinion, then that is possible. We had last year, I represented a gay Saudi couple who were journalists who came to Australia, and we managed to get a motion in the Senate calling for their release. And I mean, extraordinarily, but One Nation was interested in supporting that motion, which blew many people's minds, and in the end they decided not to oppose it. But we're often surprised when you put things out there, who comes to the party.
Yeah, and the Medivac bill, I mean, is an interesting example of where Labor and quite a lot of other people, and of course Karen Phelps, got the Medivac bill passed, whereby people with mental health problems on Manus could be transferred to Australia for treatment. Your favourite politician, Ali, saw that as such red rag that his first thing that they did when they got back in power, surprisingly this recently, was to repeal the Medivac bill, even though it was trying to help people with mental health problems and, you know, assessed by doctors. And they just saw that as an excuse for us to get people off Manus, and it was a terrible thing, that. But that means there at least was political support for the idea of getting people the medical help they needed. So we've tried to use, as doctors working with lawyers, we've tried to use a medical model to say this is a health issue, and that's why we have to help these people.
Thanks. I should apologize to those of you who put a question, but unfortunately we don't have the time to go through all the questions. Apologies again. So today we have heard from two great supporters, and I should say that it has been a privilege to be hosting this webinar and talking and having you both, Alice and David. The two key supporters of End Child Detention Coalition, who have specific expertise and knowledge on the issues of ending child immigration detention. Together, we aim to see a law that stops children detention in Australia once and for all. I think there are some key takeaways from today's webinar. One is start a conversation, what Alice said before, and Alice and David, both of them, they touched on this, that start a conversation with someone who you know about the issue of child detention and also impact of detention on them. And also try and make it someone who is not likely to know about this issue already. And also join ACDC, be an active member. I recommend you guys to be an active member, join the conference calls, meet with your MPs, volunteer with programs that raise awareness on impact of child detention. And also the ACDC needs a small amount of fund to support a program officer who coordinates our activities. It would mean a lot to us if you were able to donate something, no matter how small. It's absolutely tax deductible. If it is not, I would like to thank you all, everyone, to David, Alice, and everyone, to those who helped us with the technicians, and also all the audience who joined us with today's webinar. I thank you and have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hayat, and thanks, Ali. Good to see you.
Thanks. Bye.